We are now 39 days into a disappearance that has not only paralyzed the local community, but has sent shockwaves across the national media landscape, involving the mother of one of the country's most recognizable television personalities.
1:47 a.m. The doorbell camera goes dark. No warning, no malfunction alert, just silence. A neighborhood that had never known anything like this, still, quiet, ordinary, suddenly holding a secret it couldn't speak. Outside, the streets of Catalina foothills are empty, the kind of empty that feels normal at that hour, the kind of empty that nobody questions. But something is happening. 2:28 a.m. A medical device that had been faithfully sending signals, beat after beat, transmission after transmission, goes silent. 41 minutes. That is the window. 41 minutes between the first sign that something was wrong and the last digital trace of an 84-year-old woman named Nancy Guthrie. After 2:28 a.m., there is nothing. No signal, no movement, no trace. Just a house in the Tucson foothills, sitting in the dark, and a question that would shake an entire nation. What happened inside that window? Her name is Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, a resident of the Catalina foothills, one of the most peaceful, most established communities in all of Tucson, Arizona. This is not the kind of neighborhood where things like this happen. And yet, on the morning of February 1st, 2026, Nancy Guthrie was gone. No note, no goodbye, no explanation. Authorities with the Pima County Sheriff's Department were called to her home, and what they found there left little room for any comfortable conclusion. The circumstances, in the words of investigators themselves, strongly suggested that Nancy did not leave on her own. This was an abduction. The FBI was brought in almost immediately. A case of this nature, an elderly woman gone without a trace in a quiet residential neighborhood, demanded every available resource. Federal agents and local law enforcement began working the case together, side by side. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nano stepped forward publicly, making clear that his department was treating this with the full weight it deserved. Nancy Guthrie is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, one of the most recognized faces on American television, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show. But to the investigators working around the clock on this case, she was first and foremost a missing person, a woman who deserved answers, a family that deserved the truth. Cases like this often move quickly, and new developments can happen at any moment. If you follow true crime investigations and want updates the moment investigators release new information, consider subscribing. We cover cases carefully and keep our audience informed as new evidence emerges. Before we go any further into what happened, you need to know who Nancy Guthrie really was. She was born Nancy Ellen Long in Kentucky, a woman shaped by a different era, a different pace of life. Somewhere along the way, she found her path westward, and by the 1970s, she had made Arizona her home. She married Charles Errol Guthrie, a mining engineer. Together, they built a life, a family, a foundation. They raised 3 children, Savannah, Annie, and Cameron. Charles has since passed, but the life they built together left its mark on everyone who knew Nancy. By the time February 2026 arrived, Nancy was 84 years old and living alone in her Catalina foothills home. And here is what people who knew her will tell you. She was not the kind of woman that sat still. She remained active, she kept routines, she was sharp, consistent, and deliberate about how she lived her days. That last detail is precisely what made investigators snap to attention so quickly. When a person lives alone and follows a consistent daily routine, same patterns, same habits day after day, Any deviation becomes impossible to ignore. Nancy wasn't someone who would simply disappear without a word to her family. She wasn't someone who would leave her phone, her wallet, and her vehicle behind and walk out the door. That wasn't Nancy. And that is exactly why the moment her family realized something was wrong, the concern wasn't gradual, it was immediate, it was urgent, because the woman they knew would never vanish without a trace. 3 weeks before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, something quietly unusual was already unfolding on her street. January 11th, 2026. A neighbor noticed a man walking slowly through the neighborhood, not jogging, not walking a dog, not heading anywhere in particular, just moving through the street at a pace that felt deliberate, measured, like someone who was paying close attention to the layout of the area, the houses, the driveways, the spacing between properties. It was the kind of thing that's easy to dismiss in the moment. A stranger on the street isn't a crime. People walk through neighborhoods every day. But something about this man's behavior lodged itself in the memory of at least one neighbor. The way he moved, the way he seemed to be studying the surroundings rather than simply passing through. That detail would later take on an entirely different weight. When investigators began piecing together the timeline of events leading up to February 1st, that January 11th sighting became a focal point. Surveillance cameras throughout the neighborhood were pulled and reviewed. The question investigators began asking was pointed and serious. Had someone been watching Nancy's home long before that night? The theory that emerged was unsettling. This may not have been random. This may have been planned, calculated, the kind of operation that requires advanced knowledge of a target's location, their habits, the rhythms of their daily life. 3 weeks of silence, 3 weeks between that slow walk down the street and the night everything changed. That is not a coincidence investigators were willing to overlook. January 31st, 2026. Nancy spent the evening with her family, a dinner, the kind of ordinary, warm gathering that families have all the time without a second thought. Nothing about that evening raised any alarms, nothing felt out of place. To everyone present, it was simply time spent together. When the evening wound down, Nancy needed a ride home. The person who drove her was Tommaso Cioni, her son-in-law. Married to her daughter Annie Guthrie, Tommaso was family, a familiar face, someone Nancy knew and trusted. At approximately 9:48 p.m., Tommaso pulled up to Nancy's home in the Catalina foothills. Nancy stepped out of the vehicle. She walked toward her front door. By every visible indication, everything was completely normal. The house was as she had left it. The neighborhood was quiet. There was no sign that anything was wrong. Tommaso Cioni would later become a significant name in this investigation, not because of any formal accusation, but because of a simple, undeniable fact. He was the last confirmed person to see Nancy Guthrie alive. That distinction matters in any investigation, the final known contact, the last set of eyes on a person before they vanish. Nancy entered her home at 9:48 p.m. on January 31st, 2026. Everything appeared normal. Less than 4 hours later, that would no longer be the case. The night of January 31st rolls into the early hours of February 1st, 2026. Nancy is home. The house is quiet. By every reasonable measure, the evening has ended without incident. Then comes 1:47 a.m. The doorbell camera, the one device positioned to capture anything approaching the front of the property, goes offline. Not a power outage, not a scheduled update. The camera simply disconnects. In an instant, the one set of digital eyes on that front entrance goes dark. Investigators would later treat this moment as the starting point of everything. 25 minutes pass. 2:12 a.m. Motion is detected outside the home. Something or someone is moving in the vicinity of the property. The detection is logged, but with the doorbell camera already offline, there is no corresponding footage to explain what triggered it.
16 more minutes pass. 2:28 a.m. Nancy's pacemaker, that same medical device implanted in her chest to monitor and support her heart, sends its final signal to her phone. One transmission, then nothing. The connection that had been quietly, faithfully maintaining itself goes completely silent. That is the digital timeline. 3 data points across 41 minutes, and together they told investigators something that no single piece of evidence could have communicated alone. The camera going dark first was not a coincidence. It was the first move. Everything that followed happened precisely because that camera was no longer watching. In modern investigations, digital evidence often speaks louder than physical evidence. It doesn't forget, it doesn't misremember, it simply records. And in this case, what it recorded was a deliberate, calculated sequence of events that unfolded in near-perfect darkness. 41 minutes, 3 timestamps, and at the end, Nancy Guthrie.
Nancy Guthrie was gone. That timeline raised more questions than answers, and investigators say there may be more digital evidence still being analyzed. If you're interested in following this case as new details come out, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the updates. When authorities arrived at Nancy Guthrie's home and began examining the property, what they found removed any lingering doubt about what had taken place there. On the porch, investigators discovered blood droplets, a small detail, but in the context of a missing 84-year-old woman, a detail that carried enormous weight. Alongside that, there were signs consistent with a physical struggle, the kind of evidence that tells a story without needing a single word of explanation. Biological evidence was also collected from the scene, material that would be submitted for forensic testing, the kind of analysis that takes time but has the potential to answer questions that nothing else can. Then there was what was left behind inside the house. Nancy's phone, still there. Nancy's wallet, still there. Nancy's vehicle, still parked where it had always been. Think about what that means for a moment. When a person leaves their home willingly, even in a hurry, they take certain things with them. Their phone, their keys, their wallet. These are not items people forget. They are the first things reached for on the way out the door. Nancy left none of them. That single fact, the presence of everything she would have needed, became one of the most definitive pieces of the entire investigation. Investigators were no longer working with a theory. The evidence at that property pointed in one clear direction. Nancy Guthrie did not walk out of that house on her own terms. She was taken. Not every piece of evidence in an investigation comes from a lab or a forensic report. Sometimes the most important evidence is the kind you can see with your own eyes. Despite the doorbell camera going offline during the critical window of that night, investigators were able to recover footage that captured something significant. On that footage, a figure, a male, approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches tall, average build, moving with a sense of purpose near the property. But what stood out immediately wasn't just his presence, it was how he had prepared for it. He was wearing a mask, his hands were covered with gloves, and strapped to his back was a black Ozark Trail backpack, the kind of bag designed to carry things, to transport things. This was not someone who stumbled into that neighborhood by accident. Every element of his appearance pointed to a person who had thought about this in advance. The mask obscuring his face, the gloves eliminating the possibility of leaving prints, the backpack practical, deliberate, ready. Investigators made the decision to release this footage publicly. It was a calculated move. Put the image in front of as many eyes as possible and let the public become part of the search for answers. The response was immediate. The image of that masked figure spread rapidly across news outlets and social media platforms nationwide. In a case that had generated enormous public attention from the very beginning, this footage became the clearest window yet into what may have happened on the night Nancy Guthrie vanished. A face hidden behind a mask, but a presence that could no longer be denied. In the hours following Nancy's disappearance, investigators expanded their focus beyond the property itself and turned their attention to the streets surrounding the Catalina Foothills neighborhood. Traffic cameras, residential surveillance systems, business security footage along nearby roads, every available lens that had been pointed at those streets during that critical window became evidence. And within that footage, something emerged. A vehicle, captured moving at speed near Nancy's home shortly after the timeline closed, after the pacemaker signal went silent, after the motion detection logged its final entry. A vehicle moving with urgency through streets that at that hour should have almost no traffic at all. In an investigation built heavily on digital evidence, this was another thread, another data point that demanded to be followed. Investigators began the painstaking work of reconstructing the vehicle's movements across Tucson, frame by frame, camera by camera, intersection by intersection. The goal was to build a complete picture. Where did this vehicle come from? Where did it go? And who was behind the wheel? Thousands of hours of footage were pulled and reviewed. It is the kind of work that rarely makes headlines, but forms the backbone of serious investigative work. Methodical, exhausting, necessary. Every camera that caught even a partial image of that vehicle added another piece to a puzzle that investigators were determined to complete. The streets of Tucson had been watching that night. The question was, what exactly had they seen? Then came a development that shifted the entire public narrative of this case. Media outlets began receiving emails, not one, multiple, messages that claimed to be connected to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance and made a specific, unmistakable demand: Bitcoin payments, cryptocurrency. Untraceable by design, the preferred currency of anyone who wants to move money without leaving a clear path back to themselves. Deadlines were attached to these messages, a clock placed deliberately over a missing 84-year-old woman, designed to create pressure, designed to force a response. The moment these messages surfaced, investigators faced a question that had no easy answer. Were these communications legitimate? Was someone genuinely holding Nancy and demanding payment for her return? Or were these messages something else entirely? A hoax crafted by someone seeking attention or trying to insert themselves into a high-profile case? Or worse, a deliberate attempt to flood the investigation with noise, to pull law enforcement focus away from the real trail. All three possibilities had to be treated with equal seriousness, because dismissing a genuine ransom communication in a case like this carries consequences that no investigator is willing to risk. The FBI confirmed publicly that they were treating the messages seriously. Every email was being analyzed. The language, the metadata, the digital fingerprints left behind in the communication itself, all of it was being examined by federal investigators trained specifically for this kind of work. Someone had reached out. Someone wanted something. Whether that someone actually had Nancy, that was the question that now sat at the very center of this investigation. By this point in the investigation, the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI were deploying every tool available to modern law enforcement. DNA analysis was underway. The biological evidence collected from the property had been submitted to forensic laboratories for processing. DNA work of this nature takes time. It is precise, methodical science that cannot be rushed, but the potential it carries to identify an individual is unparalleled. Geofence warrants were also obtained. This is a legal instrument that compels technology companies to provide location data for all devices that were present within a defined geographic area during a specific time window. In plain terms, investigators were asking for a digital record of every phone, every device that was near Nancy's home during those critical hours. Any device that was there would leave a trace, and that trace could lead directly to a person. Digital surveillance mapping allowed investigators to build a visual reconstruction of movement patterns across the surrounding area, cross-referencing camera footage, location data, and time-stamped evidence into a single coherent picture. But perhaps the most extraordinary tool being used in this investigation is one that most people have never considered:
pacemaker signal tracking technology. Nancy's pacemaker, the same device whose final transmission was logged at 2:28 a.m., was capable of emitting detectable signals. FBI technicians began actively working to determine whether that device could still be located, whether it was still transmitting, whether it could lead them, even now, to Nancy. It was the kind of investigative reach that speaks to the absolute determination driving this case forward. No stone was being left unturned. No technology was being unused. Many cases have been solved because someone watching noticed a detail others missed. If you're part of this community and want to keep exploring cases like this together, subscribing helps you stay connected with future investigations.
As the investigation expanded, a number of names began surfacing in connection with the case. Not as officially named suspects, that distinction is important, but as individuals whose names had entered the investigative landscape for various reasons. Tommaso Cioni, Dominic Lee Evans, Luke Daly, Carlos Palazuelos, Walter Goncalves, Nathan Sabatino, Andrea Evans. 7 names, 7 individuals whose connections to this case, whether direct, circumstantial, or peripheral, place them within the scope of what investigators were examining. In any major investigation of this nature, law enforcement casts a wide net. Names come up through tip lines, through digital evidence, through associations and relationships that investigators piece together over time. The presence of a name in an investigation does not equate to guilt. It does not equate to suspicion. It means that at some point, for some reason, that name became relevant to the questions being asked. It is worth stating clearly and without ambiguity, as of the time this documentary was produced, authorities had not officially named any suspects in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. No charges had been filed solely in connection with her disappearance. Some of the individuals whose names had surfaced publicly had also gone on record to deny any involvement in what happened to Nancy. But in an investigation this complex, with this many moving parts, law enforcement was methodically working through every connection, every relationship, every thread that these names represented. The answers, investigators believed, were somewhere within the full picture of who knew Nancy, who knew her routines, and who had reason to be anywhere near that neighborhood on the night she vanished. The investigation was no longer confined to a single property on a single street. It spread across Tucson. The FBI, local law enforcement, and dedicated search teams mobilized in a coordinated effort that covered significant ground across the city and its surrounding areas. This was a full-scale operation, the kind that requires precise coordination between multiple agencies, all working toward the same singular objective. On the ground, search teams moved through areas identified as relevant by investigators, methodical, organized, covering terrain that digital evidence and witness information had pointed toward. Above the city, helicopters swept through the skies, extending the reach of the search far beyond what ground teams alone could cover. Aerial operations allow investigators to examine large stretches of landscape quickly, identifying anything that might warrant a closer look from below. Simultaneously, electronic signal detection equipment was deployed. Every technological avenue that could potentially lead to Nancy's location was being actively pursued in the field, not just from behind a desk. And then there was the public. Thousands of tips flooded in, from residents across Tucson, from people across the country who had followed the case and believed they had seen something, heard something, or knew something that mattered. Each tip represented a lead that had to be logged, assessed, and investigated. The scale of the public response reflected something important. This case had reached people deeply, a community and a nation that refused to look away. In a case already defined by urgency, a new development arrived that momentarily stopped everything. A body was discovered near Phoenix. The news moved fast, in the middle of an already emotionally charged investigation, with a family desperate for answers and a public watching closely. The discovery near Phoenix immediately raised the question that nobody wanted to ask out loud. Could this be Nancy? Authorities moved quickly to investigate. This is standard procedure when any unidentified individual is found within a reasonable geographic range of an active missing persons case. Every possibility, however difficult, has to be ruled in or ruled out before investigators can move forward with certainty. The confirmation came. The individual discovered near Phoenix was not Nancy Guthrie. For Nancy's family, that confirmation carried a complicated weight, the relief of one answer existing alongside the continued absence of the answer they truly needed. For investigators, it meant refocusing. Tucson remained the center of this case. The evidence, the digital trail, the forensic work, all of it pointed back to the city where Nancy had lived her life. The Phoenix discovery had been a detour, not a destination. False leads are an unavoidable part of high-profile investigations. They consume time, resources, and emotional energy, but they also sharpen focus. Every eliminated possibility narrows the path toward the truth. And the truth, investigators remained convinced, was still waiting to be found in Tucson. At this point in the investigation, authorities were still trying to piece together the timeline. If you followed this story this far, let us know in the comments what detail stands out to you the most. There are moments in an investigation when a family has to step in front of the world and ask for help. This was one of those moments. Nancy's family made a decision that spoke to the depth of their desperation and their determination in equal measure. The reward for information leading to Nancy's whereabouts was increased, and then increased again, until the total surpassed $1 million. $1 million, a number that reflected not just financial resources, but the absolute refusal of a family to stop fighting. Then Savannah Guthrie spoke. The NBC Today Show anchor, a woman whose professional life is built around delivering news to millions of people, now found herself on the other side of that equation. She stepped forward publicly and appealed directly to anyone who knew anything about her mother's disappearance. Her message was clear and it was personal. If you have seen something, if you know something, if you heard anything at all, please come forward. It was the kind of appeal that cuts through everything, not a press release, not a statement through a representative, a daughter asking the public to help bring her mother home. Law enforcement echoed that call. Authorities encouraged anyone holding even the smallest piece of information to contact investigators immediately. No detail was too minor, no tip would go unexamined. $1 million reward, a daughter's public plea, and a nation that was paying close attention. This case is not closed, it is not cold, it is not forgotten. As of the time this documentary was produced, the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie remains fully active. Federal and local investigators continue working the case with the same intensity that defined its earliest days. Forensic testing is still ongoing. The biological evidence collected from Nancy's property has not finished speaking yet. Laboratory analysis of this nature moves on its own timeline, careful, exacting, and uncompromising in its standards. When those results are complete, they have the potential to change everything. New leads continue to come in and continue to be investigated. Every tip, every piece of information that reaches law enforcement enters a process. It gets assessed, it gets followed. Nothing is dismissed without examination. And then Sheriff Chris Nanos stepped forward with words that carried significant weight. Authorities, he stated, are getting closer to answers. That is not a throwaway line from a sheriff managing public expectations. That is a deliberate public statement from the law enforcement official leading this investigation. Closer to answers means the evidence is building. The picture is becoming clearer. The distance between where investigators stand today and the truth of what happened to Nancy Guthrie is narrowing. This case has been defined from the very beginning by determination, the determination of investigators, the determination of a family, the determination of a public that refused to move on. That determination has not wavered, and the work continues.
Every serious investigation reaches a point where the evidence collected must be weighed against the questions that still have no answers. This case has several. Who disabled that doorbell camera at 1:47 a.m.? Cameras do not simply go offline at the precise moment something is about to happen by accident. The timing is too exact, too convenient. Someone understood that camera was there. Someone knew it needed to go dark before anything else could take place. But who and how did they know? Why was Nancy targeted? An 84-year-old woman living quietly in a residential neighborhood, following the same routines she had kept for years. What made her the focus of something this calculated? Was it her connection to a well-known public figure? Was it something else entirely, something that investigators have not yet disclosed publicly? The motivation behind this remains one of the deepest open questions in the entire case. Was the suspect working alone? The level of preparation involved, the advanced surveillance, the camera disruption, the timing, the getaway vehicle, raises a question that investigators have not publicly answered. Operations of this complexity rarely involve a single person working in complete isolation. And where did that vehicle go? It was captured on camera leaving the area at speed. It was tracked across multiple intersections. And then, somewhere in the sprawling grid of Tucson streets, it disappeared from the available footage. Where it went, who was driving it, what it was carrying, those answers have not yet been given. But they are out there, waiting. Nancy Guthrie is somebody's mother, somebody's grandmother, a woman who built a life across decades in Kentucky, in Arizona, in the home she kept in the Catalina foothills. A woman who raised a family, followed her routines, and, by every account, lived her life with quiet dignity and consistency. She deserves answers. Her family deserves answers. And until those answers arrive, the most powerful thing any of us can do is refuse to let this story fade into the background. Cases like this are solved because people pay attention, because someone who watched a video like this one remembers it weeks later when they hear something that doesn't quite fit, because awareness, spread wide enough, eventually reaches the one person who holds the missing piece. If this documentary moved you, share it. Pass it forward, put it in front of someone who hasn't seen it yet, because the more people who know Nancy's name, the more people who understand what happened in that Tucson neighborhood in the early hours of February 1st, 2026, the harder it becomes for the truth to stay hidden. Nancy Guthrie. Remember her name. And if you know anything at all, contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department or the FBI. A family is still waiting. An investigation is still open, and somewhere out there, the answers exist. They just haven't been found yet. If sharing this story helps even one person come forward with information, it could make a difference. Subscribing and sharing the video helps keep cases like this visible and ensures updates reach as many people as possible.